Auschwitz-Birkenau, 1942. A prisoner is called from the women's barracks. She's told it's a routine medical examination. Within hours, she's subjected to massive doses of radiation aimed at destroying her reproductive organs. No anesthesia, no consent, no mercy. The doctor overseeing this horror isn't some sadistic outlier. He's a respected German physician who volunteered for this work. His name is Horst Schumann, and unlike most Nazi doctors, he would eventually face a courtroom. September 1939. Nazi Germany invades Poland, igniting the Second World War. Within months, the German war machine sweeps across Europe, conquering nation after nation. But behind the front lines, another kind of war is being waged against civilians, against humanity itself. The Nazi regime doesn't just seek military victory. It pursues a twisted vision of racial purity, a program they call eugenics taken to its most horrific extreme. Jews, Roma, disabled individuals, political prisoners, millions are marked for extermination. But for the Nazis, mass murder isn't enough. They want to experiment, to study, to push the boundaries of what the human body can endure. Enter the camp doctors. These aren't rogue killers operating in secret. They're trained physicians, educated at Germany's finest universities, operating with full institutional support. They transform concentration camps into laboratories of suffering, using prisoners as test subjects for experiments that violate every principle of medical ethics. Among these doctors, one name stands out, not because his crimes were unique, but because his case would test the limits of post-war justice. Dr. Horst Schumann didn't just escape the Nuremberg trials. He lived free for nearly 2 decades after the war ended, but his victims never forgot, and eventually they would have their day. Horst Paul Schumann was born on May 1906 in Halle an der Saale, Germany. Nothing in his early life suggested the monster he would become. He grew up in a respectable middle-class family, attended good schools, and showed an aptitude for science. In 1930, he completed his medical studies at the University of Halle. He was 24 years old, freshly certified, and ready to build a career in medicine. For a few years, he worked as a general practitioner, treating patients in small German towns. Then came 1933. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party seized power in January of that year. Almost immediately, the regime began implementing its racial ideology into law. The Nazis didn't invent eugenics, the pseudo-scientific belief that humanity could be improved through selective breeding. American and British scientists had promoted these ideas for decades. But the Nazis took eugenics further than anyone else dared. Within months of taking power, they passed the law for the prevention of genetically diseased offspring. The law authorized the forced sterilization of Germans deemed unfit to reproduce. Those with mental illness, physical disabilities, alcoholism, or other conditions the Nazis considered hereditary defects. Doctors across Germany were required to report patients who fit these categories. Sterilization courts were established to process cases, and physicians were needed to perform the operations. Horst Schumann volunteered. By 1934, he had joined the Nazi Party. A year later, he joined the SS, the elite paramilitary organization responsible for some of the regime's worst atrocities. Schumann rose quickly through the ranks, not through military prowess, but through his willingness to embrace Nazi racial science. He became medical director of several institutions where forced sterilizations were performed. Between 1934 and 1939, he personally oversaw hundreds of these operations. But sterilization, as brutal as it was, would prove to be just the beginning. What Schumann wanted was efficiency, and the Nazi regime was about to give him the opportunity to pursue it on an unimaginable scale. The program had a code name, Aktion T4. It referred to the address of its headquarters, Tiergartenstrasse 4 in Berlin. The program's purpose was simple and horrifying: the systematic murder of disabled Germans. The Nazis called it mercy killing. They claimed they were ending the suffering of those whose lives weren't worth living. In reality, Aktion T4 was mass murder disguised as medicine, a test run for the Holocaust that would follow. Starting in 1939, disabled children and adults were transported to special killing centers across Germany and Austria. They were told they were going to hospitals for treatment. Instead, they were murdered, most often by lethal injection or in gas chambers disguised as shower rooms. Horst Schumann became a key figure in Aktion T4. In 1939, he was appointed director of 2 killing centers, first in Grafenegg, then in Sonnenstein. At these facilities, victims were registered, examined by doctors who certified their unfitness for life, and then killed. Their bodies were burned in crematoriums. Families received fake death certificates listing false causes of death. The operation was efficient. Between 1939 and 1941, Aktion T4 murdered over 70,000 people. Schumann personally supervised the deaths of thousands. But something unexpected happened. Word leaked out. Families grew suspicious when loved ones died shortly after arriving at these hospitals. Religious leaders, particularly Catholic bishops, began speaking out. Public opposition grew. In August 1941, Hitler officially halted Aktion T4. The program continued in secret, but the centralized killing centers were shut down. Schumann and the other T4 doctors needed new assignments. The SS had a suggestion: put their expertise to use in the concentration camps. The question was, what kind of experiments would they conduct? For Schumann, the answer came from his earlier work in forced sterilization. But this time, he wanted to find a method that could be applied on a massive scale. One that could sterilize thousands without their knowledge, without surgery, without the time and resources traditional methods required. He believed he had found the answer. Auschwitz-Birkenau was the largest and deadliest of the Nazi concentration camps. Located in occupied Poland, it served multiple functions: slave labor camp, extermination center, and by 1942, a site for human experimentation. Horst Schumann arrived at Auschwitz in 1941, assigned to oversee medical operations. But he had a specific research interest, one that aligned perfectly with Nazi ideology: mass sterilization. The Nazis faced a problem. Their racial theories demanded the elimination of inferior peoples, but mass shootings and even gas chambers required resources: bullets, fuel, time, manpower. What if there was a cheaper, faster way to achieve their goals? What if they could simply prevent undesirable populations from reproducing? Sterilization seemed like the answer, but surgical sterilization was too slow. Operating on millions of people one by one wasn't practical. The Nazis wanted a method that could sterilize large numbers of people quickly, ideally without the victims even knowing what had been done to them. Schumann believed he had found the solution: radiation. His theory was straightforward. High doses of X-ray radiation directed at the reproductive organs would destroy them, rendering the victim permanently sterile. The procedure would take only minutes. It could be disguised as a routine medical examination. It could be scaled up to process hundreds of victims per day. There was just one problem. Schumann didn't know what dosage would work. Too little radiation wouldn't cause permanent sterility. Too much would cause severe burns, infections, and death. He needed test subjects. At Auschwitz, he had thousands. Block 10 stood in the main Auschwitz camp, a 2-story brick building that looked unremarkable from the outside. But for the women imprisoned there, it was a place of unimaginable horror. This was where Schumann conducted his experiments. Prisoners, mostly Jewish women, though some men were also used, were selected from the camp population and brought to Block 10. They were told nothing about what would happen to them. Many believed they were being moved to better housing or selected for work details. Instead, they were taken to a room equipped with an X-ray machine. The procedure was crude. Victims were positioned between 2 X-ray plates, one aimed at the abdomen, the other at the back. The machine was activated, flooding their reproductive organs with radiation. The exposure lasted several minutes, far longer than any legitimate medical X-ray. The immediate effects were excruciating. Victims described feeling like their insides were burning. Many collapsed. Some vomited uncontrollably. Within hours, severe burns appeared on their skin. But the long-term effects were even worse. Over the following days and weeks, the irradiated tissue would begin to die. Women developed infections, internal bleeding, and severe pain. Many became so ill they could no longer work, which in Auschwitz meant being sent to the gas chambers. Those who survived faced permanent damage. Some were left sterile, which was Schumann's goal. Others suffered chronic pain, destroyed organs, and early menopause. A number were subjected to follow-up surgeries in which their ovaries or testicles were removed, so Schumann could study the radiation's effects on tissue samples. One survivor, a woman named Alina Bruda, later testified about what she witnessed. She was a Polish Jewish doctor who had been imprisoned at Auschwitz and forced to assist in the experiments. She described girls as young as 16 being subjected to the radiation, then screaming in agony as the burns developed. Another survivor recalled being told the procedure was a health check. He was subjected to the radiation, then returned to her barracks. Within days, she developed burns so severe she couldn't walk. She survived only because other prisoners cared for her in secret. Schumann kept detailed records of his experiments. He measured dosages, tracked outcomes, and adjusted his procedures. Between 1941 and 1943, he subjected approximately 1,000 women and several hundred men to these experiments. But there was a problem with his research. The radiation doses required to reliably cause sterility were so high that they caused severe injury or death. The procedure wasn't practical for mass sterilization. It was too damaging, too obvious, too likely to kill the victims before sterilization could be achieved. By 1944, even the Nazis recognized that Schumann's experiments had failed to produce useful results. He was transferred away from Auschwitz. The war was turning against Germany. The end was approaching. But Schumann wasn't finished causing harm. And more importantly, he had no intention of facing justice. As Soviet forces advanced toward Auschwitz in late 1944, the Nazis began evacuating the camp. Prisoners were forced on death marches westward. Many died from exhaustion, starvation, or were shot by guards. Schumann left Auschwitz and briefly worked at other camps, but as Germany's collapse became inevitable, he began planning his escape. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Nazi leaders were arrested and put on trial. The Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945, prosecuted major war criminals. A separate trial, the doctor's trial, focused specifically on medical personnel who had conducted experiments on concentration camp prisoners. 23 defendants stood trial in the doctor's trial. 7 were sentenced to death and executed. 9 received prison sentences. 7 were acquitted. Horst Schumann was not among them. He had fled before he could be arrested. Using false papers, he moved through the chaos of post-war Germany, staying one step ahead of Allied investigators. For a time, he worked as a general practitioner under an assumed name in a small German town. But by 1949, his real identity was becoming known. Survivors were giving testimony about the experiments at Auschwitz. Schumann's name appeared in witness statements and Nazi documents. Authorities began looking for him, so he ran again. This time, he fled to Egypt. Under his real name, he worked as a sports medicine doctor in Cairo. He lived openly, making no effort to hide. Perhaps he believed Egypt wouldn't extradite him. Perhaps he thought the world had moved on. He was wrong on both counts. But catching him would take more than a decade. In Germany, prosecutors were building a case. Survivor testimonies were collected. Medical records from Auschwitz were recovered. The evidence against Schumann was overwhelming. The problem was jurisdiction. Schumann was living in Egypt, and Egypt had no extradition treaty with West Germany for Nazi crimes. German authorities could issue arrest warrants, but they couldn't force Egypt to hand him over. For years, diplomatic pressure mounted. Survivor organizations, Jewish groups, and human rights advocates demanded action. But Schumann remained free, practicing medicine, enjoying a comfortable life. Then in 1962, everything changed. Schumann moved to Sudan, then to Ghana. He continued working as a doctor, still using his real name. But Ghana, unlike Egypt, was more responsive to international pressure. In 1966, Ghanaian authorities arrested Horst Schumann at the request of West Germany. After 21 years of freedom, the Nazi doctor was finally in custody. His extradition became an international news story. Survivors who had waited decades for justice finally saw hope. Schumann was flown back to Germany, where he was immediately imprisoned to await trial. But the legal process moved slowly. It wasn't until 1970, 25 years after the end of the war, that Horst Schumann's trial would begin. And what happened in that courtroom would test whether justice delayed could still be justice at all. It wasn't until 1970, 25 years after the end of the war, that Horst Schumann's trial began in Frankfurt. He was charged with crimes against humanity, specifically his role in the Aktion T4 killing program and his experiments at Auschwitz. The courtroom was packed with survivors, journalists, and observers. For many victims, this was the first time they would confront the man who had destroyed their lives. The prosecution presented devastating evidence. Survivor after survivor took the stand, describing what Schumann had done to them. Medical experts testified about the severity of the injuries caused by his experiments. Documents proved his direct involvement in both T4 and the Auschwitz experiments. Schumann's defense was predictable. He claimed he was following orders. He insisted his experiments were scientifically justified. He showed no remorse. The testimony was harrowing. Women, who had been young prisoners at Auschwitz, now middle-aged, described in clinical detail what had been done to them. They spoke of the pain, the humiliation, the permanent damage. Some had never been able to have children. Others lived with chronic health problems that stemmed directly from Schumann's experiments. One witness described how she had been called from her barracks at age 19. She was told she was being selected for light work. Instead, she was taken to Block 10, subjected to radiation, and then returned to the camp. Within days, she developed severe burns. She begged the camp doctors for help, but was ignored. Other prisoners smuggled her scraps of cloth to use as bandages. Another survivor testified that she had been subjected to the radiation twice, because Schumann wanted to test different dosage levels. After the second exposure, she became so ill that she was sent to the camp hospital. There, a prisoner doctor told her she had been sterilized. She was 22 years old. The evidence was overwhelming. Conviction seemed certain, but there was a complication. Schumann's health was failing, or at least, that's what his lawyers claimed. He was 64 years old and reportedly suffering from heart problems. His defense team argued he was too ill to stand trial. The court ordered medical examinations. Some doctors confirmed he had health issues. Others suspected he was exaggerating his symptoms to delay the trial. The proceedings dragged on for months. Schumann appeared in court sporadically, often claiming he was too sick to attend. Survivors watched in frustration as the man who had shown them no mercy now demanded consideration for his own suffering. Then in 1972, the court made a stunning decision. Citing Schumann's poor health, the trial was suspended. He was released from custody on medical grounds, placed under house arrest, while the court determined if he would ever be fit to stand trial. The outrage was immediate. Survivors felt betrayed. After waiting nearly 3 decades for justice, the man who had tortured them was being set free on a technicality. Schumann returned to his home in Frankfurt. He lived there quietly, under minimal supervision. The trial was never resumed. For the next 11 years, he lived as a free man. Horst Schumann died on May 5, 1983, at the age of 77. He was never convicted. He never served a day in prison for his crimes at Auschwitz. He died in his bed in his home, having escaped full accountability. For his victims, the end of his trial felt like a second violation. But the question remained: what does justice mean when it comes too late? The case of Horst Schumann raises uncomfortable questions about justice. What does it mean when a war criminal dies before being fully held accountable? Is a trial that never reaches a verdict better than no trial at all? For the survivors of Schumann's experiments, the answer was complicated. Many expressed relief that he had at least been arrested and publicly identified as a criminal, even if he was never sentenced. The trial brought international attention to the horrors of Block 10. It forced Germany to confront its past. But others felt that justice had been denied. Schumann had lived freely for 21 years after the war. His trial was delayed and ultimately abandoned. He died without ever admitting guilt or expressing remorse. Compare his case to other Nazi doctors. Josef Mengele, the infamous angel of death of Auschwitz, escaped to South America and was never caught. He drowned in Brazil in 1979, having lived a comfortable life under an assumed name. Karl Kloberg, another doctor who conducted sterilization experiments at Auschwitz, was captured by the Soviets, sentenced to 25 years in prison, but released in 1955 as part of a prisoner exchange. He returned to West Germany, where he was arrested again in 1955. He died in 1957 before his trial concluded. Schumann's fate fell somewhere in between, caught and tried, but never convicted. The broader issue was systematic. Of the thousands of doctors, nurses, and medical personnel who participated in Nazi medical crimes, only a handful ever faced trial. Most returned to normal life, practicing medicine, teaching at universities, living among the communities they had helped terrorize. The reasons for this failure of justice are complex. In the immediate post-war years, there was a shortage of medical personnel in Germany. Prosecuting too many doctors would have strained an already fragile healthcare system. Cold War politics also played a role. Both East and West Germany wanted to move forward, not dwell on the past. But for survivors, these explanations rang hollow. Today, the legacy of Horst Schumann and doctors like him continues to shape medical ethics. The Nuremberg Code, established in 1947 during the doctor's trial, laid out principles for ethical human experimentation. Informed consent, the prohibition of experiments likely to cause death or injury, the requirement that experiments benefit society. These principles arose directly from the horrors committed by Nazi doctors. Modern medical ethics education includes studying these cases, not to sensationalize them, but to ensure future doctors understand the consequences of abandoning ethical principles. The survivors of Block 10 left behind testimonies, memoirs, and legal records. Their voices ensure that what happened is not forgotten. Organizations like the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum preserve the physical evidence, the buildings, the equipment, the documents. In recent years, there has been renewed attention to compensating survivors of Nazi medical experiments. Many lived with chronic pain and health problems for decades after the war. Some never received proper medical care or financial support. Germany has acknowledged this failure. Compensation programs have been expanded, though for many survivors, the payments came too late or were insufficient to address the harm done. The case also highlights the importance of pursuing justice even decades after crimes are committed. War crimes tribunals for atrocities in Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and Cambodia have all drawn on the precedent set by Nuremberg. The principle that following orders is not a defense, that doctors and scientists can be held accountable for their actions, these remain vital. As recently as the 2010s and 2020s, Germany has continued prosecuting elderly former Nazi personnel. In 2015, Oskar Groening, known as the bookkeeper of Auschwitz, was convicted at age 93. He died in 2018 before serving his sentence. In 2020, a 93-year-old former concentration camp guard was convicted, and in 2022, a 101-year-old former guard was sentenced to 5 years in prison. These late prosecutions are controversial. Critics argue that convicting frail elderly people so long after their crimes serves no practical purpose. Supporters counter that the message matters, that there is no statute of limitations on genocide, that survivors deserve acknowledgement even if punishment is no longer possible. Horst Schumann believed he could escape justice. For 21 years, he was right. But his eventual arrest and trial, incomplete as it was, sent a message. There is no statute of limitations on crimes against humanity. The survivors of his experiments deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as witnesses who refused to let the world forget. Their testimony ensured that Schumann's name would be recorded in history alongside his crimes. And their courage reminds us that the fight for justice, even delayed, even imperfect, is always worth pursuing. Schumann died a free man, but he did not die with his reputation intact. He is remembered as what he was, a war criminal, a torturer, a man who violated every principle of medicine. That accounting, however incomplete, matters. Because in the end, history's judgment is the one verdict that can never be suspended.